Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, how are you?
Fine.
Good, Kyle. Guys, I'm not doing very well this morning. I might have to drop off the line. It's been a hectic 2 weeks, so I'll try to stay on as long as I can.
Esteemed experts and viewers from all around the world. My name is Ali Al-Junabi, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, the CEO of Trends Research and Advisory. Our discussion today is organized by Trends in cooperation and partnership with Harf and Fasla Media. This panel deals with the current heated topic titled Implications of the Russian-Ukrainian Conflict on Extremist and Terrorist Movements, and reflects the important and pioneering efforts of both Trends and Harf and Fasla Media to provide constructive visions as well as to shedding light on global problems and finding solutions to them. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will endeavor to anticipate how the current situation will evolve and to ascertain whether the border region between Russia and Ukraine would turn under the current conflict into a new hotbed of extremism that threatens the stability of the region and the whole world. Today, the parties in the conflict are calling on their supporters to join the battle, which includes extremist elements from different countries around the world. This is a great cause for concern and draws our attention to real possibility that this region will be a new home for extremism. There are conflicting forces that seek to use all possible cards to resolve the conflict of their favor. Nazi and fascist forces and groups are emerging. Side wars are erupting, and extremists and militants from around the world are preparing to engage in the conflict. There are several parties in the equations. Muslims of Chechnya, or the so-called Mujahideen of Chechnya, are divided between Russia and Ukraine. There is also a division within the extreme right over which side to align with. On the other hand, ISIS and its followers are waiting for the chance to intervene, given that this area was targeted in the past. Once again, on behalf of Trends Research and Advisory, I thank all the panelists, the moderator, and viewers worldwide who have joined us today in this discussion. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give the floor to our moderator, Kyle Orton. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Fasala, thank you for partnering with us in this. Obviously, Trends does great work, and this is a very timely webinar. So we're very glad to be a partner in this enterprise. Today's webinar is entitled The Implications of the Russian-Ukrainian Conflict on Extremist and Terrorist Movements. It's obviously related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine that started on the 24th of February. And it will focus on these dimensions of the foreign fighters and radicalization and other security issues. And we have an excellent panel to go through that with. I think to avoid taking up too much time at the start, I'll introduce each speaker as we go through. So our first speaker is Rahaf Al-Hazraji, who is the Deputy Director of Scientific Publishing, the Scientific Publishing Department at Trends Research and Advisory. So if we could go to you for the first 10 minutes.
Thank you, Kyle. Hi, everyone. My name is Rahaf Al-Khazraji, and I'm a researcher here at Trends. First, I'd like to thank Trends for giving me the opportunity to speak on this important panel. I will focus my remarks on the main issue of why areas of conflict and tension constitute a conducive environment for the spread and expansion of extremism and terrorist movements, with a focus on the Ukrainian case. The anatomy of the political mindset of the extremists indicates that their distinguishing feature is the evocation of the past. Looking at historical evidence, we find that conflict zones have always been a point of attraction to extremists of various orientations. For instance, in Afghanistan, Abdullah Azzam's call for jihad received a broad response as large numbers of extremists from several countries went to Afghanistan to participate in the fight to liberate it from the Soviet Union occupation. As a consequence of those calls, the whole world suffered from the remnants of these extremists in the form of Al-Qaeda's activities. Another example is the war on Iraq, which led to the flooding of the extremists who were so eager to confront the American enemy, as they call it, and later resulted in the emergence of ISIS in Iraq, which caused a catastrophic suffering to humanity. Also in Syria and Libya, they constitute two additional cases, and as a result of the ongoing revolution in its territories, have turned into a safe haven for the extremists who took advantage of the fragile situation there to consolidate their influence and strengthen their power. We have also witnessed the same in various regions such as Chechnya, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we're still witnessing it nowadays in Somalia and other parts of Africa, especially the Sahel region. In dissecting the causes for this polarization of extremists into conflict zones, it has been found that there are several motives. Most notably is the suffering of those who are being polarized from a situation that can be called a psychological emptiness or psychological void, which makes them fragile and an easy prey for the leaders of those terrorist organizations for polarization and recruitment. This is what we can conclude from the recruitment methods of ISIS, which exploited the political, economic, and social sufferings of the targeted youth to adopt a discourse based on feelings of empowerment and indoctrination. In this process, they create an illusory feelings of becoming valuable to their society and the world by making them believe they are, fixers of the world. Another significant reason is also that in such environments of conflicts, various states use these extremist groups as mere tools in resolving the conflict to their benefit by providing them with financial support and giving these extremist groups room for growth and spread. At times, these states lose control over them when they become too strong or independent and hence can no longer influence them, which can create other problems. The third factor I want to talk about is that chaos and conflict are usually associated with the absence of the state and the absence of law enforcement institutions, which allows these groups the opportunity to move and spread more easily. So this phenomenon is often referred to as failed or weak states that no longer have control over their territory. Today, with the conflicting parties in Ukraine calling in their supporters from different countries of the world to participate in the war, an alarm bell rings, drawing our attention to the fact that the region could possibly become a home to extremism. There are many extremist groups that might find a foothold in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. From one angle, we have the Muslims of Chechnya, who are divided into two groups. The first group are those who are loyal to Russia, led by the Chechnya president, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is estimated to have around 10,000 to 70,000 fighters. And the second group consists of these fighters who are resentful against Russia since the First and Second Chechen Wars and consider Russia as an enemy that must be confronted, which makes them stand on the Ukrainian side. On the other hand, there is the Ukraine extreme right wing, which formed many combat battalions calling to raise funds to contribute to repelling the Russian intervention. So in the 2014 conflict, the number of these battalions was estimated at 37, some of which were affiliated with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and the National Guard, and special units also affiliated with the Ministry of Interior. Among them are the Azov, the Ukrainian Volunteer Corps, Kiev 2, and the UNSO battalion. The situation that was created by the Russian-Ukrainian conflict became a major point of interest for ISIS. The organization dedicated the editorial of the 328th issue of its Al-Naba newsletter to the war, labeling it as Crusaders Against Crusaders Wars. It pointed out that democracy, which ISIS is fighting against, has started to die out by itself, describing it as the starting point for wars between European countries and a realistic manifestation of the Russian-American conflict. The most important aspect of ISIS stand in this war is criticizing the Chechen fighters who announced their support for Russia and trying to strip them of the concept of jihad that is promoted by the organization. This is considered as a regular practice by terrorist organizations in their attempts to attract elements of other factions to join them. And ISIS may reap the fruits of this if the war continues and intensifies more. There are also large numbers of Russians who has been fighting with ISIS. Within 1 year, the number of Russian fighters in the organization, in ISIS, increased by 300%, as they were accounted for about 2,400 terrorists in 2015 compared to 800 in 2014, the majority of whom are from the North Caucasus, Chechnya, and Dagestan. In addition, Russian involvement in Syria against ISIS may push the organization to try to infiltrate the region as a retaliation move against Russia and fight them at their homeland. We have also witnessed in the past few days reports of attempts to transfer fighters from Syria to fight alongside Putin. Their number is estimated to reach around 23,000 fighters, despite the calls that are being launched from Syrian Salafi jihadists for the need to remain neutral. These reports and information may answer our main question concerning the possibility that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict could provide an attractive environment for extremism. Certain questions that should be discussed are what are the chances and possibilities for European right-wing elements to move to the region? And what are the implications of that on Europe and the West? Also, what are the chances and probabilities for ISIS to succeed in expanding its influence in the region and its chances of attracting anti-Russian and anti-Chechen elements, as both Russia and Chechnya fought against it in Syria? We can also ask, what are the chances of ISIS elements moving from nearby outposts, such as Afghanistan, to the area of conflict? And lastly, what is the possibility of the emergence of independent extremist groups from inside Chechnya, which is divided between Russia and Ukraine? And yeah, with that, thank you for listening. I'll go back to the moderator, Kyle.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Ezat Ibrahim, who's the editor-in-chief of Al-Ahram Weekly, and he's going to talk about the extremist and terrorist movements that may exploit this conflict. Over to you, Ezat. I fear we may have a muting issue. Ezat, you're on mute. I think this is a technical issue, unfortunately. If we come back to you next, Ezat, we'll go over to Jacob Zen if we can, the Jamestown Foundation Terrorism Monitor in Washington, D.C. And Jacob is going to talk about the impact of the Russian invasion on Central Asia and the West. Jacob, if you can take the next 10 minutes and we'll circle back to Ezat.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to the panel, and thank you for Trends for organizing this. I'll speak for a few minutes on West Africa and Central Asia, which some might perceive are on the periphery of the Russia-Ukraine issue, but are distinctly affected by it. And I'll focus on how these events affect terrorist and other militant groups in these regions. It's important when starting with West Africa to note that these countries in West Africa recently faced a major challenge from foreign fighters to ISIS during the main fighting in the Syrian war. So West African countries have become very cautious about any additional foreign fighters going to other conflicts. Among the population of some West African countries, there is sympathy towards Ukraine, as there is in a number of other countries around the world. In Senegal and Algeria, however, when Ukraine offered for Algerians and Senegalese to join the International Legion in Ukraine to fight against the Russians, both the Senegalese and Algerian governments requested that Ukraine take down their recruitment call because they were afraid of their own citizens going to fight. And I believe in Senegal, they noted around 30 citizens had joined to fight in Ukraine. But as far as I know, that recruitment call has stopped. And I presume in some other countries in West Africa, those recruitment calls are stopping because the countries are concerned about any potential ramifications of fighters joining a foreign conflict, becoming radicalized by either side, and then returning home and conducting attacks. So we can see that the conflict has had an influence on citizens in West Africa in that way. On another end, it's important to note that in a country like Mali, we've seen the withdrawal of French forces from the country as a result of disputes with the military rulers of the country that came to power by a coup last year. And we've actually seen increasing Russian influence in Mali in their counterterrorism efforts, at least ostensibly through training of the Malian armed forces. And this has involved the Russian Wagner group, who are commonly referred to as mercenaries, as well as formal Russian military trainers. So among the governments of the region, there is actually some sympathy towards Russia or close relations towards Russia. And this even dates to the Cold War era, when a lot of the current leaders of some West African countries and the current elites would have been pro the communist side during the Cold War. So it's actually possible to see more Russian engagement of West African countries, ostensibly on counterterrorism, especially as France and perhaps other Western countries reduce their focus on counterterrorism in West Africa to focus on elsewhere. And also at a time when Russia is being increasingly sanctioned and ostracized by the international community, it sees an opportunity to become closer to other countries in West Africa diplomatically. There actually has also been some evidence of some Russian-backed militants in West Africa supporting the Russian side of the conflict. In Central African Republic, which is a country that has seen Russian support to put down rebellions, there's been a video released of Central African Republican militants claiming to support Russia and that they want to fight for Russia, because Russia is conducting its own recruitment drive to source international fighters that support it to also fight for it in Ukraine. I think it's still very early on in this conflict, in a sense, especially in the West African perspective. But the key takeaways are to note that there have been some West Africans who want to fight for the Ukrainian side, who have generally been restricted. And there have been some West Africans, such as those in Central Africa, that want to fight for the Russian side. And the third point was that Russia will probably try to boost its counterterrorism cooperation with West African countries. I don't know how effective it will be, just in the name of itself not being ostracized. The attack, however, by Russia on the International Legion headquarters in Western Ukraine in the past day or two might actually further decrease the chance of any individual from West Africa joining that International Legion, and perhaps even the West, as now they are specifically being targeted by Russia. The Central Asian case is also an interesting one, because the Central Asian countries were, of course, under the Soviet Union. They were part of it, and they maintain close ties to Russia in the sense of migrant workers in Russia. The Central Asian countries also generally speak Russian language as a second language. And also there were many Central Asians who joined ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Afghanistan and later Syria. And that numbered well into the thousands of Central Asians in those conflicts. Whereas West Africans in those conflicts were much fewer, perhaps only in the dozens when it comes to Syria. Now, as a result of the Russian conflict in Ukraine, in my view, it's going to, one, make the Central Asian countries on a political level more tentative, or to certainly think twice about engaging closely with the West, certainly about engaging closely with NATO, which had developed some partnerships with Central Asian countries. As many people may know, Russia does not assert any territorial claims on the Central Asian nations, but parts of Central Asian nations, particularly Kazakhstan, have large Russian populations. So there are some people who speculate that Russia could exert pressure on Central Asian nations through claiming a part of northern Kazakhstan. Either way, politically, this has also meant that the Central Asian nations are tentative to show support for Ukraine. Although I do think that they are concerned about the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, because as former Central Soviet states, it also brings back the prospect of perhaps Russian incursions into other Central Asian nations. However, they haven't been very vociferous about that. At the same time, there have also been speculation that Russia would try to coerce some of the Central Asian nations to send some of their soldiers to Ukraine to support the Russian effort. I haven't seen very strong evidence of this yet, although there have been some reports that of planes lifting off from Kazakhstan to enter Ukraine in some way, but I don't think there's any confirmation on that. So it still remains to be seen how the Central Asian states will react to the conflict in the longer term. That's certainly a development that's unfolding. As far as I can see, they're taking a more wait and see approach. In terms of Central Asian individuals, I also have not seen that much evidence that they have traveled to Ukraine to join the conflict. The governments certainly don't seem to be promoting them to travel at all. And I think the fact that many Central Asians went to Afghanistan and Syria has also made the governments more wary of any travel to Ukraine and what that might bring. In terms of the jihadist elements from Central Asia that had been in Afghanistan and Syria, I also have not seen them traveling to Ukraine, although it's likely that of the two sides, they would support Ukraine because Russia has been bombing a lot of the Al-Qaeda aligned militants in Syria and has also attacked ISIS at several times. And from an ISIS perspective, Russia has actually been cozying up to the Taliban, which is of course the ISIS enemy in Afghanistan. So that's another reason why ISIS would be against Russia. But in general, the jihadist ideologues in those movements have advised thus far to let the infidels, as they perceive both sides, continue to fight each other and weaken each other. and that would actually include the US weakening itself by embroiling itself in the conflict, and they haven't advised their fellow jihadist brethren to join either side, but they just want to watch these larger powers destroy themselves. So it's still very preliminary for both these West African and Central Asian states, but it's important to watch the political reactions, the reactions by ordinary individuals, including those who might become foreign fighters, as well as those who are already militants in one way or another in each of the theaters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Azat, are we able to?
Can you hear me now?
We can. Excellent.
Yeah.
Take away.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I would like first to thank Trends and Dr. Abdullah Ali, and Dr. Fatouh Heikal, Dr. Khalid Abdel Hamid, and our moderator today. I think I agree with our last speaker that it is preliminary to watch the outcomes of the impact of the war in Ukraine on fighting terrorism and on the state of the terrorist groups in the region. But from the discussion, I can tell that it's clear that the impact is already spilling over, and the inconceivable consequences of have begun to haunt the global community. Of course, most conflicts end with diplomacy, but we are quite far from that. So my intervention is to deal with the impact of the war on terrorism and whether the terrorist movement in the Middle East would benefit from the clash between two most influential powers in the Middle East, the West and Russia, or more from the repercussions of the food shortage and the unaffordable prices. And to conclude with possible scenarios on regarding employing these lethal groups in new proxy wars. So I think we have two levels of in our discussion today. That we have the first is dealing with terrorist groups, advantage beyond the war in Ukraine, and second, we deal with the new phenomenon of foreign fighters. I think we are not looking through a crystal ball here, but we are mulling over lessons that history is still offering over and over again. The irony is that the same people who build a coalition to fight extremist and terrorist groups are the same people who violating the rules-based world order. History learning us a lot when it comes to our topic today, of course. I think that if I can describe the situation or the state of the terrorist groups in the region right now, in a short sentence, I can say there is an expansion outside the region and a relative decline in activity inwards. But with the continuing fight in Ukraine, and that might change depending on the scale, intensity, and the duration of war, I think the outcome will decide upon these three elements. In February 9th, last month, the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for Counterterrorism said in front of the international organization that the course of events indicated that Al-Qaeda and Islamic State with their affiliates posed a real threat, and that global war on the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant will be a long-term game. The difference between ISIS in the years that witnessed the rise of the organization and today, that ISIS now has become more fragmented and more decentralized, which enable it to continue. Of course, the organization ability to market itself as a state has weakened, and it cannot be no longer acquire tracts of land as it did 7 years ago. But still, the group is able to launch coordinated attacks that leave bloodshed. Terrorist organizations are moving towards more decentralization in their work as a result of the strikes inflicted on them in Iraq and Syria. My point here, in the absence of appropriate security and military responses to the escalation threats, copies of the Islamic State are gaining steady momentum, mainly in the African continent. The organization is active today in failed states, countries with civil wars, and places where there is an administrative chaos. After Ukraine, I think I'm calling this as a predicament of the international system, and we have many elements here that some of those changes that happening now is taking place in the international system. First, the decline of the rules-based international order, the deliberate weakening of the role of the United Nations over the past 3 decades has contributed greatly to a more chaotic world and the violation of sovereignty of other countries. In my opinion, that is in the case of the war on terrorism, United Nations monitoring mechanism of terrorist organization should be kept in place. The loss of the mechanism will lead to gaps that are difficult to bridge. Second, the return of military alliances. With all this, the role of proxy wars and the role of mercenaries and these foreign fighters to obtain funds, freedom of movement that allow them to expand and spread through special arrangement with the parties that coordinate with them. We have number 3, I think, the legitimization of foreign fighters or mercenaries corps and after Ukraine. From a legal perspective, groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda are considered global terrorist groups. Therefore, that traveling to joining them in conflicts abroad has been criminalized by many governments, as well as any support provided to this group directly or indirectly. So we need to think about this. I think such legal aspects are under severe violation in Ukraine right now. If I may, talking about the crisis on extremist movement in the region, saying there is an analogy with the development that accompanied the crisis of COVID-19's pandemic. Terrorist organizations in the Middle East may mimic the model of exploiting the pandemic and expansion and spreading their activities, as did the Islamic State in a number of African countries, where the organization exploited the economic and social repercussions accompanying the spread of the pandemic to gain foothold in African countries. The pandemic imposed social restrictions and caused political tension and economic decline after several countries directed resources to combat terrorism, to the sources of combating terrorism, to efforts aimed at countering the effects of the COVID-19. The signs of the crisis in Ukraine, I think it's starting to cast this long shadow on the societies of the developing world, including countries of the Middle East, which will lead to the rise in the prices of oil, natural gas, and grains, most important of which for us here is the wheat and corn. I don't want to take too much time, but I think I want to put in front of you some scenarios on the scenarios that I'm expecting for the war and its impact on the region. A number of scenarios that can be developed to how extremist organization would deal with the current regional and international situation. I think the scenario one is containing the crisis in a short period of time and reaching a settlement on the status of Ukraine that allows the normalization of relation between Russia and the West and lifting of the severe sanctions, which means that extremists and the terrorist organizations in the Arab region will not be able to make the most of the vacuum arising from directing full attention to the war. I think it's the crisis end without resorting to the risky military escalation or imposing complete isolation of on Moscow. The international system will be maintain a degree of cohesion that allows it to continue the involvement of the influential parties in dialogues on issues related to combating terrorism and avoiding slipping into global chaos. The scenario number two is the fighting continues in Ukraine and the concerned parties continue negotiating without agreement on political solution for several months, which will lead to more human tragedy and displacement of more refugees. At the same time, the global economic crisis deepens due to the high cost of raw materials and foodstuff, which raises the level of tension in a number of Middle East countries that cannot deal with the catastrophic effects of the crisis. The outcomes here, the terrorist groups can benefit from potential unrest and protest, especially in countries that are already witnessing armed conflicts and where depend on American or Russian support. The danger of terrorist organization exploiting the preoccupation of the major powers with situation in Ukraine and trying to gather their forces to launch effective attacks in certain regions in order to regain some of their lost influence, especially in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and some parts of Africa. This can be minimized if the conflict in Ukraine can be contained in medium term. The last one is the fighting in Ukraine will continue for unknown period in the future, and the Ukrainian crisis will turn into a global confrontation between NATO and Russia on European soil. And the potential war will witness the use of all possibilities available to both parties, including the employment of terrorist organizations against the interests of each other in Middle East and other parts of the world, return of wars by proxy that could revive this organization in a return to the scene of Afghanistan at the end of the 70s. And this catastrophic scenario, the economic, living and social crisis in the Middle East will deepen, and the organizations will find extremism and terrorism have an opportunity to regain their full strength and finding new resources by extending their control over areas far from the control of government, central government, especially in fragile countries. I myself, I think it's the second scenario. In the midterm, I think it's more applicable to the situation in Ukraine. And I would like to stop here and thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Theodore Karasik. He's a senior advisor to the Gulf State Analytics, which is a geostrategic consultancy in Washington, D.C. And he's an adjunct lecturer at the Dubai School of Government. His talk's going to cover the international threat picture, particularly the chance that certain rogue actors like Iran and North Korea will take advantage of the distraction. Over to you, Dr. Karasik.
Thank you very much, and good day to everyone. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to run through a few points. I think so far the discussion here has been excellent. Jacob hit some really key spots involving Africa and Central Asia. I think here, though, we really need to be looking at the concept, first of all, of strategic distraction. Everybody is focused upon Russia, Ukraine. This means that if you're playing red team, you're going to try to do something while everybody else is distracted. And that's why, for example, I know this is not really in the terrorist realm, but it's important to be watching countries like North Korea and with their missile tests since the beginning of the year. The acceleration of this process of what North Korea is doing is important to understand in the wider context of security architecture in the Pacific as the crisis with Russia and Ukraine continues to grow. Now that's at the state actor level. Now, when we're at the non-state actor level, I think what's really important.
Dr. Karasik,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you speak a bit louder, please? It's not being picked
Yes.
up by the microphones very well.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay.
I can. That's better.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now, when it comes to non-state actors, I think what's important here is to pay attention to the evolution of their discussion. And I think as we begin to see Russia, Ukraine pull in foreign fighters that are fighting on both sides, it's important to pay attention to the discourse that's occurring. We saw this earlier during the Maidan Revolution on both sides of the fight. And it was interesting to note at the time the impact it had on fighting in theaters at the time. I think given the current trajectory of groups like Islamic State, which are highly decentralized, but also with the emergence of a new cadre, if you will, that are seeing the evil of Russia in this particular regard, will begin to discuss these issues about Russia and Islam. And that then brings into the question, third point here, about what is the future of Islam and Russia and counterterrorism. I think it's very important to pay attention to, although there's a tremendous 30s style crackdown going on in Russia, this was all preparatory for trying to prevent uprisings by particular groups. But I think it's important to pay attention to places like Tatarstan, for example, and Kazan, because in Kazan you have under the president, you have really quite a unique situation in that particular republic, but also the way the republic is able to lead. This all might have come to a screeching halt because of sanctions and so on. But what happens in Tatarstan might be a measure for the rest of the Russian Federation, and whether or not there's any kind of look, if you will, at the role of Tatarstan in the larger picture of Islamic threats to the Russian state. The longer that this crisis goes on, the more likely the trajectory of something like this occurring. So I just wanted to bring up these three quick points. All of you guys are doing a fantastic job analyzing this. So I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Obed Labelle. He's a policy analyst at the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. He focuses on security in the Middle East, particularly Russia's role. And today he's going to talk about Moscow's role in supporting the international far right and the potential opportunities jihadists will have as Moscow reallocated security resources to Ukraine. Over to you, Obed.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Trends and the European Eye on Radicalization for organizing this and inviting me as one of the panelists. I'm going to focus, like Kyle said, on Russia's support for the far right. You hear a lot about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and I'm not going to specifically discuss Azov. I mean, we can do that later, maybe in the Q&A. But one of Putin's justifications for this war is denazification. Now, I don't know what that means when a country has a Jewish president whose family died in the Holocaust, and et cetera, et cetera. But that is one of their justifications. So I'm going to discuss Russia's support for neo-Nazis, and not just support, but the fact that they've turned themselves into the Iran of white supremacy. Like, they've been gathering in far-right forces from all over the world and supporting them. So I'm just going to start the story with the Iron March Forum, which was founded in 2011 by a kid now identified as Alisher Mukhitdinov, I think his name is. But essentially, the Iron March Forum spawns all of these transnational neo-Nazi groups. One knows Atomwaffen Division and all of its spin-offs like Sonnenkrieg, and the base, the next group I'm going to discuss as well. But he's running this transnational neo-Nazi forum, uploading some pretty serious things, including bomb-making material. And he was recently found living in Moscow, just, unwatched, unbothered. So very clearly has a relationship with the Russian government. And then we have the base. So the base that's a playoff of Al-Qaeda, obviously. And the base's leader, Ronaldo Nazzaro, was recently identified. And it turns out he's also been living openly in Russia, filmed wearing a Putin t-shirt. And in fact, it looks like the group was actually founded in Russia and has been recruiting from there. We know that Nazzaro has been vetting far-right recruits, including in Australia, from Russia. And again, lives totally openly, clearly has a relationship with the Kremlin. Unclear exactly what it is, but he is, for all intents and purposes, a Kremlin asset. And so this group, the base, it was recently designated as a terrorist organization here, but it still operates completely openly in Russia. And it's also been designated by several other countries in the world. And that brings us to basically the crux of this neo-Nazi international that Russia's building is the Russian imperial movement. Now, regardless of its exact relationship with the state, people say they have an understanding. I would say it's a lot more than an understanding, but the Russian imperial movement trains transnational neo-Nazi groups across the world and dispatches their operatives back. And several who have done these training courses have gone back to conduct attacks in their own country, specifically Sweden. So the United States designated the Russian imperial movement in 2020. I think that's the first time that they've ever designated a foreign neo-Nazi movement. I use neo-Nazi as a very broad term. Let's just say far right. And then, of course, you have the Wagner Group, which Jacob mentioned. And the more digging you do on Wagner, the more you turn up neo-Nazis. It's clearly core to the identity of the group, whatever it is. I mean, it acts as a proxy of the Russian government, to put it charitably, but it is overall a neo-Nazi group, and it is employed to commit atrocities on behalf of Russian imperialism from Ukraine to Syria to across Africa, like Jacob was saying. Now, the reason I bring this up is because all of these assets have always existed in the West. Like Russia, these people are based in the West. Russia has a really close relationship with neo-Nazi attackers. And it's quite possible that as a result of the sanctions, and Russia is going to have to respond asymmetrically. And so we've come to understand destabilization and Russian influence campaigns and cyber attacks. But they do have another tool, and that is increasing their support and funding for these neo-Nazi groups to commit attacks in the West. I would not rule that out. Now, that's all well and good, but there is the potential for a good outcome here, which is that popular opinion in the West is currently so united against what Russia has done that it's going to end up isolating any politicians and the far right political parties that Russia has been close to. Well, ideally, that's what's going to happen domestically. So I don't know whether this will increase or decrease the threat, but the threat is real. And for all of Russia's talk about Ukrainian Nazis, I mean, there are many powerful neo-Nazi leaders living very openly in Russia and supported by them. And so that's on the far right side. Now, I also want to build off of what Jacob was saying earlier about Russia's presence in Central Asia and Africa. Russia's been displacing France across Africa and trying to offer itself as an alternative imperial pole or security partner. But what this war has exposed, I mean, it's just been, I'm trying to think of another term, but it's been mortifying for Russia. Like they've exposed that their military is a fairly hollow force and they can't actually fight. So what Russia's experiencing now is fairly severe overstretch, imperial overstretch. And that's going to get progressively worse as sanctions wear down its military and its ability to pay off, the leaders who are working for it in Africa and elsewhere. So this is going to leave space for jihadists in the Sahel and elsewhere, especially in places like Mali, where the French have been pushed out and the Russians come in. Wagner is, I don't know whether all the reports of Wagner leaving these various African states where they were fighting to go to Ukraine. I don't know how accurate those are, but they are definitely going to have to pull back and draw on more and more resources to focus on Ukraine. And the more that happens, the more space it leaves for jihadists to exploit. And the more instability, because, for instance, in the Central African Republic, like Jacob was saying, Russia is the sine qua non. No, I wouldn't say it's for stability, but it's the only reason the government can stay in power in that civil war. And the drawdown and the sanctions and just the general embarrassment, the political embarrassment of this campaign is going to have an effect on the continent. I don't know how soon, but it will. And then there's in Syria, where Russia is already failing terribly to contain the Islamic State insurgency in the east. If you read the most recent Pentagon Inspector General report, it's not a good situation. And the overstretch of the Russian Air Force, they've demonstrated that they can't mount two operations at once. So which is why the Syrian skies were clear of the Russian Air Force for a long time, for the first time in a while when Russia invaded Ukraine. They're not going to be able to, they were already essentially combat ineffective, and they're not going to be able to hold that down for long. And then finally in Central Asia, I mean, you have the Taliban running Afghanistan, and you have essentially security client states of Russia. Like now their security is entirely dependent on Russia. And Russia's current military weakness is going to leave a major opening for the expansion of jihadist groups. I don't know what the Taliban will actually do, but an attack on Tajikistan or one of its other neighbors cannot be ruled out after watching what's been happening, and Russia would not be able to intervene easily. So I'll close by saying that this conflict does leave openings both for jihadists and for Russian state-backed neo-Nazi terrorist groups in the world.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Anna Casarova. She's the director of the Central Asia Institute for Strategic Studies, or CASE, which focuses on bringing perspectives on security and political matters in Central Asia to regional and global stakeholders. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Kyle. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me, and thanks for a very fruitful discussion and a fantastic panelist today. I've prepared some footnotes, but I would really like to jump in and reflect to what some of you guys said, that that's exactly reflected in my presentation. So at least 3 points that I kind of keep up for this conversation today. So if we speak about implications of the war, not implications of the Russian politics, or not the implications of recent developments regionally or globally, or the US-Russia relations. So if we focus on war and its implications, Russian-Ukraine war and its implications on extremism, terrorism, and then regionally, there are several things that we should kind of highlight. First one is that we should first start speaking about Ukraine, obviously, and talking from and starting this conversation about legitimizing far-right movements and organizations that were there and now are legally fighting within the Ministry of Defense and National Guard, and all the decisions, all the political decisions that were forced by this war, could also highlight and impact greater far-right threat that of it was speaking recently across Europe and Central Asia and globally. The second point is about implications of this war for Central Asia. I somewhat agree with Jacob and Ovid on how dependent Central Asian countries are on Russia, military, politically, and etc. But on the other hand, there are several thoughts that I think that have not been properly discussed. And I think the current war is kind of highlighting the rising far-right movements in Central Asia, and particularly in Kazakhstan. So previously we have been speaking about jihadists and those joining ISIS, like thousands of people joining ISIS, but now we see this clear informational warfare, so to say, that involve far-right members and organizations that are funded by Russian organizations, which should not be obviously overlooked. Now, how the public is divided in terms of addressing and perceived Russian-Ukraine war is also challenging, and it's challenging not only in Kazakhstan but across Central Asia, and it's a bit different. So it's not a unified position overall. But when it comes to foreign fighters, there is also another interesting thing to mention, so to say. So when Crimea happened, when Crimea was annexed in 2014, back then, there were several ethnic Russians from Kazakhstan that traveled to Ukraine and fought in Donbass and were prosecuted when they returned back to Kazakhstan. So the issue here is that it's illegal to fight in a foreign conflict zone, and then across Central Asia, and then how all these foreign fighters will be then redistributed or brought back. Will they be brought back by the US, UK, or other countries who are kind of saying, okay, you can go and fight there? Or should we speak about criminalization of those acts, as some countries do? And that's also a matter of legal repercussions of that. This is also a challenging question, but so far we haven't seen or observed any Central Asian involved directly in Russian-Ukraine war. However, there were several publications, or I would say speculations of fake news posted by Russian media, saying that some migrant workers from Uzbekistan were involved in fighting on the Russian side. But on the other hand, we haven't seen that much number. And now everyone is aware that fighting in being a foreign fighter is obviously illegal and they will be sentenced for a great amount of years, so to say. And the third point that I would also try to think is that this war kind of leaves the space for both jihadists and the far right. Coming to the issue, like what should we speak about, and what repercussions will be for Ukraine, like globally, or for a certain nation? It is a really challenging question, and speaking about leaving a space for extremist group, or the joint combination of forces between jihadis and far right or neo-Nazis, as Ovid just explained brilliantly with the Russian support of these organizations now fighting in Ukraine and across Europe, is also not only a challenge for the European continent now, but I would also say that this is the whole point of rethinking of extremism and terrorism for each and every country and nation. So what does that mean, and who foreign fighter is, and how all the nations that are now have their citizens fighting in Ukraine will deal with this issue, as many countries have already dealt with the returnees from Syria and Iraq. So this kind of questions are still in my head, and I think that it's really too early to kind of answer that. But on the other hand, understanding why so many different people went there and fight there, that's the question that kind of keeps me thinking why it's something different that is happening now in Ukraine in comparison to all other parts of the world where kind of similar grievances or similar challenges exist, and they feed different groups of and different ideologies of people, fight for. And here in Ukraine, I think that's how it's different. So it's the combination of everything, a little piece of everything that kind of now is mixed, and time will need. We will need some time, I think, to reflect on that, but it's really a lot of groups, a lot of ideologies, lots of weapons, lots of political agendas, hidden agendas. It will take some time to reflect more. I'll stop here and we'll be happy to answer questions. Kyle, over to you.
Thank you so much. Our final speaker for today is Colonel David De Raj. He's a professor at the Near East and South Asian Center for Strategic Studies and at the National Defense University in Washington. He's a former US government official working on security matters on the Gulf and in Pakistan, and obviously has authored several books as well. So Professor De Raj, if we can go to you.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate it. Some of my points have been covered by the other speakers, so I'll go fast and hopefully there'll be questions. I want to talk about a strategic implication of the war, which is the wheat market, and Izzat kind of highlighted that earlier, and then a tactical one, which is the use of drones. It's a real honor to be on with these experts, but let's see if I can come up with something different. So first off, the region, the Middle East, North Africa region is fragile. This is no surprise to anybody, but it's vulnerable to all of the root causes of insurgency or terrorism. In general, it's one of the more corrupt regions in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa surpasses it. Also, the region contributed a lot of foreign fighters to Daesh. This is from 2016. And you can see that, Tunisia was the largest country providing foreign fighters. Russia, of course, was also a large country from that, but, the population of Russia compared to the population of Tunisia, is quite telling. And some of the other countries that really concern me are places like Egypt and Libya, which, have issues as well. Not only did these countries, so the countries are ripe for disruption because of corruption, inefficient government. A number of them sent foreign fighters to Egypt, but a number of them also have insurgencies, Daesh inspired or follow-ons to Al-Qaeda as well. And so you have insurgency or terrorist possibilities domestically and overseas. And a lack of governance, which, incubates this sort of stuff. So the question is, how can it get worse, and how will the Ukraine-Russia conflict make it worse? Well, the first thing is we have to look at the presence of food insecurity. And food insecurity is kind of endemic to many countries in the region. And what particularly concerns me is that this chart doesn't show population. When you look at Egypt, given Egypt's large population, the fact that 11% are considered food insecure is of great concern. And of course, Syria, where over half the population is considered food insecure. And this is a slightly old chart, so I'd argue that food insecurity in Lebanon is much greater than it was when this was done. And of course, Palestine, which in the UN, I think includes Gaza as well, 21%. Clearly, this is a hotbed for potential terrorist movements. Then, not just food insecurity, but such security as we have is dependent on large part on imports of grains. So the Arabian Peninsula, 80% to 100% of their cereal is imposed. That's really only of concern for Yemen, which, you know, again, already has an ongoing war. The other countries can afford to pay whatever they want. But when you look at Iraq, Syria, Tunisia, and Egypt, with 40 to 60% of their cereals imported, this becomes a matter of great concern. And of course, Algeria and Mauritania already have ongoing insurgencies and terrorist movements, and they're at 60 to 80% of imports. So now if we look at imported wheat, which of course is what bread is made out of, it's sort of the key grain. What we can see is that Egypt has imported almost 26% of the region's wheat since 2007. And most of that wheat comes from Russia. The former French colonies of North Africa, not surprisingly, tend to import from France, and the rest of the region tends to import from Australia. So if there's a disruption to the wheat market, you're looking at a pretty serious effect on these countries, and particularly the one that concerns me most is Egypt because of its population. Well, who does export wheat? You look at this and you see that Russia is the largest exporter, followed by Canada, then the US, then France, but then you have Ukraine. And the problem here is that we're looking at a very large amount of wheat removed from the world's export market. And this isn't like the drone attack on the Abcake refineries where you can fix it and it goes online in 2 weeks. If the farmers don't plant the wheat, if they can't maintain the wheat, you can't, work twice as hard and get a new harvest. So what we're seeing is a significant amount of the world's wheat will be lost, mostly in Ukraine. And then another part of the world's wheat will be either embargoed, impounded, difficult to ship, difficult to pay for. So a significant portion of Russia's wheat exports will effectively be unavailable for the world's market because of sanctions and other movements on Russia. So that leads to a wheat shortage. And the problem is, again, particularly bad here, because when you look at who buys wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and the way the war is going, most of Ukraine's wheat will be removed from the market and a lot of Russia's wheat. And you can see that, and unfortunately, this is in dollars rather than in tons, but Egypt is one of the major consumers. And, that's used to buy subsidized bread, which has long been viewed as sort of a bedrock of Egyptian political instability. When the subsidies on bread were proposed to be removed by Anwar Sadat, he quickly reversed himself because there was public unrest. This shows breakdown specifically for Egypt. And as you can see, they get about 79% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So the removal of 79% of that market means that the prices will go up. And Egypt, as a country that's already under fiscal stress, will suffer most from this. And I worry about this because, if you look at the leadership of the main Al-Qaeda organization, the secession of Osama bin Laden, the leadership's almost entirely Egyptian. And the fact that you have that population there, that you have a insurgency, which, has kind of come under control in the Sinai, but can revive itself, and the number of foreign fighters exported, plus Egypt's critical role as both leader in the Arab world and astride one choke point and possibly two, if you consider the Bab el-Mandeb. This has real implications for security. And to try and give you an example of where we are, this chart shows food prices in the wake of the fiscal crisis, 2008, 2009, and then droughts. And you can see that food prices spiked. The black line shows global food prices. The red line shows specific countries. And in every one of these countries where the food lines were above the norm, the global norm, they're definitely above what people expected. Every one of these countries had some degree of political instability. The Arab Spring, popular protests in Oman, which in the past had been more or less unheard of, revolutions, or civil wars erupted. So, this food shortage means that poor countries that are fiscally stressed, like Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, they are going to, based on past performance, there's a real possibility of political instability that'll lead to terrorism. Now, let me shift to the tactical innovation, because everybody's talking about drones. This is the Houthi drone arsenal, which is basically the Iranian drone arsenal with a paint job. Drones are every war has a sexy weapon that comes out of it. Desert Storm, it was Patriot. Falklands, it was the Exocet sea skimming missile. Since the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and now in the Ukraine, people are talking about the Bayraktar TB2 drones, or the Russia 4-cent drone. And of course, they do have the ability to hit targets accurately. You see this is the Abqaiq refinery in Saudi Arabia before the attacks, and the three red rectangles on the right, groups of the holding tanks, they were all hit by Delta Wing drones fired by Iranian forces. This is the wreckage of the drones that struck at Abqaiq in the back, or cruise missiles. There was also a complex drone and missile attack last year at the main Aramco oil refinery facility. Missiles were fired down here in the south at the residential Aramco compound, although I think it was actually fired at a different compound. But there was a drone attack on the large storage facility at Ras Tanura here, and here you see a video of the Ras Tanura. And that has captured the imagination of security leaders around the world, because they see an unparalleled degree of vulnerability. Of course, in the Ukraine war, we looked at this convoy, which dispersed the day before yesterday. And there is footage of drone strikes on it, but the question was, why not more? And the answer, I think, is that this shows one of the TB2 drone strikes is that they were prioritizing their targets. So this vehicle here was targeted by a Bayraktar drone. This is a Russian anti-aircraft missile launcher, and they basically hit this launcher because they wanted to have a secondary explosion that would also kill this launcher and the support vehicles, which were probably having missiles on it. Basically, what we see is that drones are very useful in warfare, but they are not a one-size-fits-all solution. They're not the killer weapon that just causes everything. They have to be integrated with ground forces and with an existing fire or artillery network. And the distance that the Ukrainians have to operate at, combined with the overall mass of the Russian armed forces, means that they just don't have enough drones to effectively destroy these forces here. They can contribute to immobilizing it. They can contribute in slowing down the advance of the Russian forces, which then allows the pretty poor logistics network that the Russian armed forces have to do what it does, which is fail under stress. This is a Russian drone, which was shot down and captured. So both sides have them. This is primarily an observation drone. It's pretty good. So I introduced those two topics. Some of the other speakers, of course, have introduced them as well, but I just wanted to give some visual illustration of what we're talking about, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move into a period of open discussion for 15 minutes. Does anyone have anything they wanted to put to the rest of the panel? If not, I can put a question out, and we can see where we go with it. In terms of the Western response so far, is there anything that's not being done that you think should be done to stem the flow of extremism and radicalism in Ukraine, or to restrain it? Is there any obvious mechanism that's not being pursued? If we go first to Rahaf for a response. I think you're on mute.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Can you just repeat that?
Is there anything that you think that, in terms of the sanctions or the US and Western response in general to the Ukraine crisis, that should be being done to curtail extremism in Ukraine?
Well, I'd like to talk briefly about the GCC's neutrality in terms of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I know Saudi Arabia is ready to mediate between all parties related to Ukrainian crisis, and they sent millions of dollars to the Ukrainian humanitarian aid. But I mean, the West probably have done whatever they could to, elevate.
That makes sense. Does anyone else have anything to add into this? Could you go to Eza? Do you think that for an Egyptian perspective on this? I can.
Yeah, I would like to comment on the idea that Egypt is vulnerable to the repercussions of the war in Ukraine. I think that we, concerning the wheat and corn, that Egypt is having a stock of 8 months at least right now of wheat and corn, especially wheat, which is make Egypt less vulnerable to the fluctuations on the international market. The idea that the reviving of ISIS in Sinai and other parts of the country or something like that, I think Egypt is different now from 7 years ago. The country is, the Egyptian army is much better equipped with on how to deal with the situation and against these groups, which is I think it's a lot of progress has been made in Sinai in the last 5 years at least, and now Egypt is this kind of intelligence coordination with other major Arab countries in the Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. I think it's much better than before, and Egypt, and especially in this crisis, Egypt is aware that the region is going to for more changes in the near future, and that the change should be observed well because of this. There is some weak areas in the region that the terrorist organization might infiltrate to these weak areas, like the situation now in Syria is quite fragile, and the situation in Libya, the situation in Yemen and other parts that Al-Qaeda and ISIS can exploit in them in the future. So I think it's important to take the precautions and to take serious steps on the regional security issues. I think we need some sort of a regional security forum for all countries in the region that can interfere to address these issues. The food security is important as besides the idea of fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Food security is behind most of the region unrests, the region's upheavals in the last 10 years. So food security is still important, is still should be addressed well, because of it's one component of the repercussions of the Ukrainian crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to note, if anybody wants to jump in, there is a raise hand feature, and if you press that, I can bring you into the discussion. But just to build on this and to go back to Professor De Raj, I mean, Egypt seems like a vulnerable country because of the wheat situation. Is there anything that can be done realistically to mitigate that by the US or by Europe, or is it just one of those things that we'll have to will have to be borne out?
Yeah, boy, it's tough because you have to plant and grow and harvest. You can't do it quickly. So there are reserves. I'm glad to hear Egypt has grain reserves, but at the end of the day, I think the only thing that's really viable is trying to do some sort of import substitution program. So the United States runs a surplus of rice. And that might be diverted. I'm sure that we have folks at the Department of Agriculture that are taking a look at that. But the greater issue is the confidence that people have in the state. And the problem is, the more services that the state supplies, the more important it is the state have a reputation for being, even-handed and incorruptible. And many of the Middle East, North Africa states, unfortunately, do not have that reputation. And if people are literally dependent on it for their livelihoods, you get to desperation. And so we've seen natural disasters followed in a few years by revolutions or terrorist movements. So the Nicaraguan earthquake in 1972, followed by the Nicaraguan revolution, because the Nicaraguan state was so corrupt. We saw the mid-90s, the earthquake in Egypt, which was then followed by what was almost a civil war, the rise of Gama Islamia, most of whose leaders, are now Al-Qaeda's leaders, or were killed. And this happens all over. So it's just a point of concern, and I'm not sure if the stockpiles globally or the donor base is big enough to make up for what the expected shortfall might be. We'll see.
No good news on the horizon. I wanted to actually go to Jacob next and to ask about the situation in West Africa. I mean, and then I'll to bring over in if we can. But do you think there's a possibility of France recovering its position if the Russians do move out a bit, or is it just one of those things that, again, we will have to deal with the fallout if the Russians withdraw forces? I think we're having a technical problem. Sorry, Jacob, can you, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so on the issue of the French withdrawal from Mali and Russia's increasing influence. So it's important to note, France is not withdrawing from the Sahel completely. It's just reducing its footprint in Mali and perhaps relocating its troops to Niger. And I think Russia, when we talk about bringing the Wagner Group mercenaries in, or bringing Russia's own military instructors into Mali, even if Russia was sincere about countering the insurgency in Mali, countering the insurgency in Mali, then I still don't think that they would be effective, because one, France had 5,000 troops in Mali, and they still weren't able to combat the insurgents. And France has a longer history in the region and has a better understanding of the local language of, say, government officials that they're working with. Russia, although it has some Cold War history in Mali, it doesn't really speak French or any of the local languages, which makes countering an insurgency even harder. And the number of instructors and mercenaries on the ground is way too few to have a major impact. So I look at it more as of a political move by Russia to sort of reassert its influence at the expense of France, similar to what it has done in Central African Republic. And this was before the Ukraine conflict broke out. But I think it's just part of Russia's effort to find support in the world wherever it can, in the light of growing animosity with the West. At the same time, it's important to note the insurgents in Mali are portraying the French withdrawal as a major victory. And as they are loyal to the Taliban, at least the Al-Qaeda affiliated militants, they see the French withdrawal as akin to the U.S. withdrawal, and they see themselves as coming to power in Mali. It remains to be seen if those Al-Qaeda affiliated militants in Mali will followed the Taliban footsteps in trying to make themselves somewhat compatible with the international community. Thus far, they haven't, but given their loyalty to the Taliban, that is possible.
Thank you very much. I want to spin off that and go to Anna about the Central Asian aspect of this, because obviously Kazakhstan had an eruption of disorder in January, and the Russians basically sent troops to put that down. But do we think that that could flare back up again during this? And obviously, if it did, the Russians seem too overstretched to do much about it. And then there's Tajikistan, which has this unique position within the Central Asian states, and it's somewhat separate from the others. How do you see trouble on the horizon for any particular state in Central Asia? And if it erupts, do you think the Russians can do much about it?
Thanks, Kyle. That's one of the questions that we've been trying to address for the past several years. I mean, even when Crimea was annexed back in 2014, there were huge debates, about the future scenarios of the northern and eastern parts particularly of Kazakhstan, that were dominated by the ethnic Russians. That Putin and Russia can come and save them from whatever thing that they are not satisfied in with Kazakhstan. Since that time, I think the overall situation was getting better, and we haven't seen that much like tensions and conflicts. But when it comes to the current situation and how the country is reviving from its January events and the huge unrest and protests now, it's really hard to speculate whether Kazakhstan could be next after Ukraine. That was the same paradigm that we had, like 8 years ago. But on the other hand, there are lots of groups and lots of groups of people, and unorganized groups of peoples, I would say, that are supported by different Russian far-right organizations or neo-Nazi organizations that kind of boost information space and kind of add on to lots of different grievances that the country is now facing. So it's a yes and no, I would say, answer to your question with regard to Kazakhstan. But like recent information about like how people reacted to CSTO coming and kind of Russia coming and saving situation in January is really controversial. Some were saying like that's okay because the law enforcement and security services really failed to deliver. But on the other hand, for others that were purely against this. But that happened. I mean, that happened in January, and the country's like reviving from those events. And it's really now interesting to see how politically Kazakhstan is responding to whatever like political commitment or whatever message that the Russian government is sending both to Russian people and abroad. So it's really difficult and different at the same time to see, because it's trying to balance and maneuver. But on the other hand, we see some political movements of the government. When it comes to Tajikistan, it's a bit different. Like having a huge military base there, as well as having direct borderline with Afghanistan and Taliban and other extremist and terrorist groups there, makes it really different and unique for Russia. Come and save them if that is the case. And this narrative has been widespread across CSTO for multiple years since the first announcement of the U.S. troops withdrawal from Afghanistan, but nothing happened. Then was the second announcement, and again nothing happened. Russia didn't come and save us, or Tajikistan or other Central Asian countries. Were not that situations that particularly push Russia into Central Asia. So Russia is really busy with other parts of the world now instead of focusing on Central Asia, which is good. I'll stop here. Over to you, Kyle.
Thank you so much. Obed, I know you had something to add.
Yeah. Yeah, just building on what Jacob was saying, everything is correct. France is not withdrawing, right? They're repositioning around the Sahel. But my worry is just in terms of the implications of the war. Even before the war, the U.S. was talking about drawing down its assets in Africa, and France is heavily reliant on that. And I think after this war, both France and the US are going to have to stop focusing on counterterrorism missions, or at least as much. So in combination with Russia's inability to really replace them, I think we're going to see problems there at some stage. We'll see. Hopefully not.
Thank you. And if we go to Dr. Karasik, do you have any last words?
I am here. 1 second.
All right.
Thank you very much. What everybody's saying is actually quite fascinating, because we're clearly at a juncture in history where we are entering really a lot of unknowns, not only in terms of Islamic theology and what's happening within schools of thought, but also the impact of Russia-Ukraine upon these schools of thought. The discussion of Africa and Central Asia, as I mentioned before, is really key to what happens with Russia, and there is debate about really what Russia's activities are in Africa, but I think that we have a pretty good idea that it's more about optics and politics and some financial aspects. But what's happening now is that we're getting into a period of time where the pandemic is still here. And I'm really curious as to what Islamic terrorist groups will be discussing as the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues and whatever its aftermath is. And then where do these groups see themselves locally or within the larger picture? Some of them may be speaking about local grievances, as Dave and others talked about. Wheat and food availability come 6 to 8 months from now. But what I'm watching out for is the same thing that I watched out for after 9/11 and for several years after that, which was looking for discussion in this literature for apocalyptic thinking. And this was being done. We did quite a bit of work on this topic back in 2002, 3, and 4 with Al Qaeda. And I'm just curious to what these groups will be thinking now when they're looking through religious terms towards what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, what's happening to Moscow, what's happening in other parts of the Ummah that Russia is part of. So I will end there. And so this is just more to think about than anything else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have anything to add in at the last? It's been great to have you all here. Thank you all very much for your contributions today. It was an excellent presentation for everybody, and it covered a lot of ground. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.